Well, I hope you can tell that I am not driving. I'm in the car with Vicky. She's driving for me, and I'm doing this recording because I can't be two places at one time. But with technology, actually, I guess you can. And we are on our way to a wedding. Debbie Dobbs is getting married, and we are on our way to that wedding. I promised Debbie that I would be there. And I'm not going to be able to make it back. Sam and I had talked about doing something together on this sermon series as we launch this new series pertaining to Paul. And so I wanted a chance just for a moment to talk with you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sam. Actually, we're going to tag team, just not in the way we had envisioned initially. So I want to talk with you about Paul, and I want to begin with having an honest conversation. Why Paul? Why be interested in Paul and his letters? Because you know as well as I do that many people today have sort of a negative impression of Paul. And when you look at it and listen to people, you begin to understand. So people have this negative impression because, on the one hand, some claim that Paul's letters are, well, quite honestly, they're just obsolete. It's like reading someone else's mail from the first century, and we know very little about the first century. And the message and even some of the issues that he writes about really seem quite obsolete. They aren't really relevant for our time. That's one of the criticisms. There are others who actually dislike Paul's writings because they believe that he endorses slavery. He is harsh, even hard on women. He talks about women being subordinate and even subject to serving their husbands in the husband-wife relationship. And in short, he seems to justify systems of oppression, including the relationship we have with the government. As a matter of fact, Paul writes in Romans that let every person be subject to the governing authorities. People look at that and they read it, and on the surface it appears that Paul is, well, quite honestly, Paul is not radical enough. He doesn't call for change enough in the mind of some. You can understand, too, especially if people are reading Paul's letters as sort of a blanket statement. But the truth is, they're not a blanket statement. We so often are too quick to try to dismiss Paul. I mean, he is first and foremost an apostle to the Gentiles. He is this missionary pastor who is in conversation with real people who are in struggling churches. They're either in new communities of faith that are just struggling to stay alive, or they are congregations that have found themselves embroiled in some kind of argument or controversy in their time. And so he is always writing, but he's writing in a conversation. It's not in a vacuum. And so that's an important thing to understand. The other thing about Paul, I would say, one of the reasons I really like Paul is he was a Christian mystic. He had this life-changing experience on the Damascus Road. It wasn't the only time. He insisted that our real life is always found in Christ. That's his most favorite phrase that he uses again and again, not just in Philippians, but in all of his letters. And in Christ, he says we share both Christ's crucifixion, but also his resurrection. We are found in Christ. That not only puts us in relationship with Jesus, it puts us in relationship with each other. Another reason that I think we ought to be listening to Paul, pay attention to Paul, he's an apostle to the Gentiles, and he was always in contention with people who wanted to narrow salvation down into legalism. Especially some of the Jewish community, they had a hard time listening to the message of grace being preached, and they wanted to turn salvation back into law. Paul was always contending for grace. For that alone, I think Paul deserves to be heard. He is always contending for grace everywhere he goes. As a matter of fact, if you don't believe me, go back to Galatians and read, "For freedom Christ has set us free," he says. And that is exactly the spirit of Paul in all of his letters. He believes in the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ and believes that freedom ought to be lived out responsibly by each one of us. He also stressed grace. Now, this is the one point I want you to remember. he stressed grace, the grace of Jesus Christ for all of our lives. And he talks about grace for salvation. He was always contending for grace. If you heard a horn in the background, that was Vicky blowing the horn because I think she liked the idea of grace. I think she needs it. Yeah, she does. For these reasons alone, the idea that he preaches freedom, the importance of grace, how important that is for all of us. I mean, there are many other reasons. I think we'd all be surprised at how radical, even what a revolutionary Paul really was. And his message still rings true, and it has relevancy for our time. And I would hope that in this series that you and I would take more seriously the letters of Paul. Now look, here's the deal. For some people, I think Paul is almost lifted above Christ in the Gospels. But here's the deal. Paul was a man, feet of clay, made mistakes, goodness. You see his anger come out in his letters. Sometimes he fired back in anger in hot words that probably if he could have it to do over again, he'd take them back. But he put them down nonetheless. You see all of that come out in the letters. You see his humanity. But in the middle of that, there's a message. There is something that rings true for life, for us. And I hope that we will all take that seriously as we read Paul. So, Sam is going to pick up and go from here. I hope all of you are doing well. I look forward to the weeks ahead because here's what we're going to do in this series. We're going to talk about Paul and slavery. I'm going to do that next week. I'm going to talk about does Paul really subvert slavery, or does he just quietly endorse it? And what are you and I doing about the issues of our time that need to be changed? And then the next week we're going to talk about Paul and women. Now, you need to be there. Yeah, I heard a horn on that too. And then the final sermon of that series, we're going to bring it all together again and talk about Paul and his emphasis of grace and salvation over all of our lives. So, for now, I will go, and I hope all of you are doing well and take care. And Sam, you go, man.